You have to learn when to care, son, Liren said softly, and when to let go. You'll see. I had similar problems when I was younger. You'll grow calluses. Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Storming Journey, where we'll be discussing chapters 20 and 21 from The Way of Kings. I'm Liz, and I'll be your Ardent for this episode.
I'm Elle, and I'm today's Worldsinger.
I'm Adam, and I am the Veristitalian.
So today's theme, just to put that right out there, is trauma. So if you don't feel up for talking about trauma today, this might be an episode you want to skip. For my world singing, though, I am not going to disclose my most traumatic moments because nobody wants that right now, least of all me. But kind of similar to Adam's world singing from last episode, I felt like I wanted to acknowledge the traumatic moments that are currently taking place. And by currently, I don't think this is ever going to stop in the near future. Like, in general, the world is a pretty traumatic place from birth. But like currently, right now, as we speak, it is February of 2026, and some traumatic things have been happening in the United States, which to me hits a little bit more close to home. I grew up in Minnesota and have friends living in the Twin Cities right now. And I just barely 6 months ago moved back from Columbus and have friends and family who live in Columbus, and that is one of the places that ICE has been heading towards. And then in the midst of all this, it's extremely easy to see traumatic imagery, even just on a casual basis, which is really hard because it's not something you want to see when you're in the line at the grocery store and you're just scrolling through your feed because that's what you do when you have a spare 2 minutes. What else are you going to do? Talk to people? No, of course, you're going to get on Bluesky or whatever. So I do have a little bit of advice. First, download a Tetris-like app on your phone, if possible, to help with seeing traumatic imagery. I will provide some sources regarding that information in the description because it can help reduce the effect that traumatic imagery has on you. Other games may help, but Tetris is the only one that has actual data on. And the other thing is to check your settings, even if you've already done this, for turning off autoplay videos on social media. I had done this on Bluesky and then I updated and it turned my feature off. So just double check that every once in a while so that you're not caught off guard. So that's my world thing for today. An acknowledgement of life being hard.
I always put a plug-in for just deleting social media off your phone, too. I know it's not possible for everyone, but I always like to put that plug in because I'm that type of person. For the Storm's Eye view, we're going to take a look into our good old sad boy Kaladin. We're getting some past and some present for our wonderful hero of this narrative. So in the past, Kaladin attempts to save a little girl in his village. He knows what to do, and so he acts and tries to heal her, but ultimately he loses her. As such, he begins to grow what his father calls calluses, things that he wonders if they really should be grown or not. Fast forwarding into the present, an exhausted Kaladin continues his life as a bridgeman, trying to lead and save his men, but obviously failing because they do not trust him yet, nor do they have any hope in what he's trying to provide or do. And then while Kaladin is exercising, Syl, our flitty little windspren, comes down and asks him what madness is and why do men lie? Big questions, little spren. And that's where we're going to leave it for our Storm's Eye view.
Excellent, excellent. Good summary. So yeah, there's a lot of traumatic events that happen both in the flashback chapter, right? Okay, so this girl gets attacked by a white spine, and so she's obviously had some trauma, medical trauma, and Kaladin, in trying to save her, also incurs some trauma from not being able to save her, even though he did everything right, which I think can be the worst kind of trauma. Like, I did everything right and things still didn't work, is really hard. And then we go to chapter 21, which is kind of a sequel chapter after Kaladin has saved these bridgemen. So they are recovering from the trauma of going on this bridge run and the injuries that Kaladin's trying to save them from. So I thought we could look at in this chapter what determines how we respond to our trauma, because I don't think anyone can expect to go through life without having some kind of traumatic experience. I just don't think that's a thing that we get to choose. But what determines how we respond to trauma? And do we think Lyran's idea of eventually growing calluses to these horrible things happening is helpful or harmful?
I think growing calluses is helpful and necessary to an extent. I think that the connection that I made was I keep having bad experiences with the medical system in a different way than Kaladin does, but this is kind of what happens when you have a undefined medical issue that doesn't have enough research about it yet, is you kind of just keep getting a very unhelpful advice or no advice. And it makes it really, really hard for me to go to a doctor because it feels like I'm doing the whole Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Okay, here we go again. Let me give you my entire medical backstory and explain why I'm here today with you. And it makes me not want to do it. I do not want to go to a doctor appointment because I have to do that again. And for what? It would probably be nothing. It might be harmful even. And so if I'm going into it with like an open wound, so to speak, of saying, I'm going to get hurt, this is going to make me hurt more, it's definitely not going to be a good doctor's appointment. Even in the best case scenario, like, I'm still going into it in thinking I'm going to feel pain. And going to react probably worse to anyone touching that pain. But if I have grown a little bit of a callus to it, if I've said, okay, this might not help, but like I'm willing to try, then it's much easier to approach that situation. And so I think there's like a boundary line between like how callous you can get though before it becomes something that like interferes actively with the healing process.
I was thinking between the idea of a callus and the idea of building muscle. So a callus is usually developed on your skin when you're doing like manual labor, when you're doing something that like puts pressure. I didn't quite look into the medical mechanics of callus growth because that doesn't interest me. Now it interests me as I'm talking about it.
I was just going to say I have 2 kids who play string instruments, and that's definitely a thing. Like, you get calluses the more you practice. If you don't practice enough, you don't have calluses, and then it hurts to practice.
So many things give us calluses. But I was thinking specifically about, I was like kind of putting on my little gym bro hat, which I occasionally have. I don't have it that often, but like when you go to the gym and it's like, do you develop calluses or not? Do you wear the gloves or not when you're lifting the really heavy weights and you're kind of like a weightlifter? And I was thinking about that in relation to this because it's like calluses are something that is very natural to grow, but they're also something that like if you have a lot of systemic support, you don't always grow them. I was kind of viewing them as something that's grown in the wild. And so that's why Kaladin needs to develop them as he's developing in the medical system itself, versus like when you're growing muscle or when you're growing other parts of your body, you're very pointed and you're very like, you can develop calluses doing weightlifting, but at the same time, like there are ways to do weightlifting where you won't really develop calluses, right? If you bear different things or if you do different things or if you make different decisions. And it's like, I was thinking through the purpose of calluses and what they do in response to like the external factors that are creating them.
And I'm thinking how the word callous is related to like the adjective callous, like callousness, which we see from Sadius, right? Who's like, fine, we won't give these men any food and we'll let everyone see why we can't afford to save Bridgman. And just kind of this, like, you don't want to be with a doctor who is that kind of callous, right? Like, it's definitely, I feel like something that happens more to surgeons because their patients are always asleep. You don't have to deal so much with that. I've read several medical memoirs, and it seems like that's a thing that, like, you get this sense of playing God and you stop viewing people as people because you've developed this callousness to the injuries that you see, because otherwise you couldn't do it. But if Lyrin wanted to, like, if Lyrin didn't develop a callus, like, it would be extremely hard to do surgery if you, like, really felt that trauma of that other person. If you had really strong empathy, I feel like that would make it extremely hard to do surgery and to make the decisions that we see him making in other chapters, right? That, like, well, this finger has to go, or, like, I can't save this leg, but I can save the rest of the person. And, like, being completely open and sensitive would make that utterly impossible. So, like, there's this balance, I think.
I mean, there's that very, very famous riddle of, I cannot operate on this boy. He is my son. And why can the doctor not? Because she's his mother. But, like, that, like, yeah, that would be really hard as a parent to operate on a child. And, like, that would be hard.
At the same time, I wonder if this idea of callous or callousness brings a negative angle to it, which doesn't help us get to that place where you can still do that without being as negative and cold to the world. Because there are weird places where you have to make very big decisions sometimes, and you just have to make a decision. And but you can do that in a way of still being positive to the world. I think about some of the medical memoirs that I've read, and it's more about the system that doesn't allow them to heal after all of these surgeries, right? After all of these moments, that is what dehumanizes, right? It's not the having to make the decision in the moment. It's the having to make that decision over and over and again every 5 minutes on a 12-hour shift, right? And so it's like the larger things that are building calluses isn't just the act itself. It's also all of the structure around it, which is interesting to think about with Lyrin, right? Where Lyrin has a structure that supports him in some ways, but we see throughout the book that that structure goes away and becomes a very negative structure, where the city or the town that they're in, right, is not supportive, is supportive in the small ways, but like the government, when Wistio arrives, is not as supportive of his work, and that calluses him even more. And that makes him a little bit more, I keep returning to hard-heartedness, thinking about Mormonism in relation to this, right? And it just like, I wonder if there's a way to develop calluses without becoming callous.
Okay, so I got very excited because I looked up. I was like, okay, hang on. Are these words actually related? Because I am the linguist. I have to check that. And they are actually. They come from the same Latin root meaning hardened. And so that's why I got excited, because, like, thinking about this idea of hardening, especially in the context of Mormonism, hardening has a connotation of bad feelings. Like, you want to be someone who is soft. Even in Mormonism, there is a aspect of masculinity that I do actually really appreciate, that I was thinking about the other week, that, like, masculinity in Mormonism includes crying in public and being open about feelings in a degree that is not part of common American culture or, like, masculine culture. And so when we talk in general about, like, this idea of being hardened, is there even a way that we can talk about being hardened in a way that's positive? And I don't know.
I think there is in this chapter, because we see at the beginning of chapter 21, Kaladin, it wakes up and feels awful, as you do, after you've just, had a really, like, he exercised the day before, and then he went on a bridge run and saved a bunch of people who people didn't want him to save. Like, so he wakes up feeling sore and tired and grouchy, and then he forces himself to get up anyway, right? And this like growing callous to your own indulgence of yourself is, I think, part of self-control and like gaining the ability to do things that are hard that will build you in the future. It requires you to, in some way, ignore what you actually want in the moment, right? To ignore present self being a soft panda bear and saying, no, go back to sleep. And just say, no, you are going to go running this morning in the rain, in the cold, and let's go. You're going to get up and do that now. So there is like this callousness almost to yourself and not being overly self-indulgent. I think there can also, people can take it too far, right? But we do see that like that has a positive response from the other bridgemen in this chapter, that like when they're all watching to see if Kaladin's going to actually do it 2 days in a row, right? They're saying, like, is he going to get up? And after he gets up, more of them are getting up and they're watching and they're curious to see what's going to happen because he's chosen to do something hard that he doesn't have to do.
I think, like, it's definitely a balance that I'm not good at in terms of, like, my own hardening or pushing myself to do things. Like, but I think where it becomes harder is how we do that with other people and how we treat other people. I think that, like, for example, I think Kaladin's relationship with his dad could have been a lot better if his dad has sat with him in this moment and said, yeah, this is really hard. Like, I'm sorry that you did do everything right. And this is an experience when I also did give him a similar experience of I also did everything right and it still didn't save somebody. And I think that requires a level of discernment and a level of humility, especially if you feel like you're more hardened than somebody else, to say, my approach is not what they need right now. What they need right now is some softness and some, like, mourning with those who mourn, to use the Mormon phrase, and not just like buck up and get through it. Like, there is a moment for get through it, but like I think there's also a moment for softness that like young Cal really needed and didn't get.
I really like that you pointed that out, because one of the questions I'd written in our show notes was, how do we help other people cope with trauma and how do we deal with it ourselves? And are these things different according to the book? And I think they are. And I think you're pointing out that, like, when we are the person outside, from our last episode, when we are the herdsmen, like, we need to be soft and offering empathy and love and understanding. But sometimes with ourselves, we have to go the other way and take ourselves in hand and do, cognitive behavioral therapy things, like do the thing and then feel the right way later, rather than wait for the right feeling and then do the thing that you feel like doing. So it's interesting that it's different when we're dealing with other people than with ourselves. The being callous and hard to other people doesn't often work. I mean, it's certainly not endearing Sadius to the Bridgeman.
I think about how different Kaladin's mother would have responded to him with the calluses. I still think she would have said something similar to Liren, but I think she has a different delivery where it's just like, come on, buckaroo, buck up and walk with me. Whereas Liren's more like, you're going to have to, I'm living this life of a surgeon and you're going to have to live this if you want to, because I want you to live this life with me. And his mom is a lot more like, all right, little kid, let's keep going, like kiss the bruise and move on type of thing. And I find their parenting examples in relation to the development of their children's calluses, right? Which like is ultimately like metaphorical for just like developing as a human being, right? We all have to develop our ability to face the traumas of the world. Our lives begin in trauma, our lives end in trauma. It's trauma all the way through, which is great. Like that, it's a very unifying thing if you think about it. It's a unifying thing that we don't really talk about, right? We don't walk around going like, "How is your trauma today?" I wish we did. I wish we could do that to everyone, right? Donald, how's your trauma doing? Liz, how's your trauma doing? Elle, how's your trauma doing? I'm trying to think who else is big. I don't know. But like, I do think that's such a fun insight to the father of Kaladin, where he has developed these calluses, and so he is implementing that onto his son. And so, like, is there a different way that he could have raised his son to develop calluses in a different way? And Kaladin ultimately develops calluses in a different way than Lyran does, right? Which we see throughout the entire series. Kaladin develops it through, like, stepping away from that ledge, from, becoming a radiant and having that protection side. But he also goes through large swaths of depression, large dips to his ups, right? And there's this like really fun tension there.
I think what you're contrasting of Hesina and Lyran's is, to me, it feels like Lyran is saying, Kaladin, deal with your trauma by yourself. I have gone through trauma. I'm telling you you should deal with your trauma. Go deal with your trauma. You need to just deal with it. But Hesina it seems like she like creates community with Kaladin and says, we are going to deal with your trauma together. And I really think, like, as I've seen reactions to traumatic stuff going on, over and over, the advice that I have seen for people is the way to get through these traumatic situations is by building community, is by being together, by standing against it together, not by isolating ourselves and taking it on individually. It's about what are we doing together to get through the trauma? And I think that's really what the difference is with Kaladin, with both of his parents, is one says, go do it. I want you to do it. And the other says, I want you to do this, but I want to do it with you, because it's hard to do on your own and you don't have to do it by yourself. I think Kaladin, the way he grows those calluses is because he has a support system in the future. That's what helps him heal and build those calluses, is he has other people he can depend on, not just himself.
I mean, specifically, he has Syl, right? And this is his fourth ideal of accepting people he can't save, right? He's starting right here, right now, with this, like, Cal can't accept that he can't save people. And when he's talking to Rock in this chapter, he's like, yeah, I'm sorry I let you down. I let 8 people die. And they're like, no, we had way less casualties than everyone else. You did a great job. But Kaladin sees this as a failure, and it takes him a long time in building this relationship with Syl and thinking about like what he's doing to build those calluses, to accept that he won't be able to save everyone. And that's hard for him.
It just keeps making me wish that I had a mini therapist. And then I also remember, just as an aside, that like we forget the design was supposed to be Elokar's Spren. And just thinking what kind of therapist design would have been to Elokar. Just, I don't know, sit with that for a second.
Especially after watching that animation from this week. For the Kickstarter for the Hoyt storybooks. The first week is out now, and yeah, design not the most empathetic person, but maybe that's what Elokar would need, is he does need to build some calluses about people telling him his flaws, because every time someone tells him his flaws, he crumbles and then they have to back off, right? Like, nobody can tell him, hey, that was not a smart decision that you just made, without him being like, oh, I think I'm a bad king and you wish I would die. And it's like, okay, chill out, man. We gotta help you become better at this. And to do that, we gotta tell you what you're doing wrong. But no one can do it. So maybe design would have told him what he was doing wrong.
Design is on that level with Yasna, where it's like, I am ride and die. Like, we are going to town, for me, especially after that little animation. Since we're speaking about Sprin, though, could we briefly talk? It's not in the chapter per se, so we're going to have to go outside of the chapter a little bit. But just about so the crossing of a sprint from the cognitive realm to the physical realm is a very traumatic event itself. And we know Syl has gone through traumatic events as well. So I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about Syl's trauma and Syl's reaction to that, right? Here in this moment, she's still developing, right? So she can't remember the trauma, but I still think that affects, right? It's affecting her because she doesn't have the memory, but also I think it's affecting her and asking about madness and about lying as she's watching Cal develop his nice little calluses, right? So I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about her trauma and the relationship. I don't know if that's derailing where you want us to go, Liz, but it's something that I would love to talk about.
I think it's a good thing to talk about because we do see our first glimpses of Syl remembering a few things. Let me see if I can find the quote here. So Syl says that it seems I've heard men talk about times when there were no lies. And she's starting to remember some of these things. And it is interesting that the Spren, their memory and their capacity comes back as they form bonds, which is kind of the same thing Elle was talking about with Kaladin, and if Hesina had taken him into hand about this and helped him through this. Would Kaladin have become someone, have been able to accept that he couldn't save everyone earlier if he had had someone to form that bond with? Maybe we do need to go from here into our sacred reading methods. So the sacred reading method I wanted to do today was again a parable, because Syl is always asking these really insightful questions. And often parables in the New Testament are a result of someone asking a question. So I wanted to read this chapter as an answer to Syl's question. She asks, what is madness? And then she asks, why do men lie? And when I was first reading through this chapter, I was like, those don't have a really obvious connection to the events of this chapter. So I was wondering if we could see anything in this chapter that is a response to Syl's question. What stories it might help us explain these questions that Syl is asking?
I think the first one that I'm thinking about is the whole conversation in terms of Sadeas telling Kaladin, through the line, telling Kaladin why he can't have healed men, or why he can't have wounded men. And this idea that I have to leave them behind because otherwise it would be too much to feed them and whatever. And I think outside of the book, can understand that this is kind of a pretense for what is going on. And I think that it shows an example of people lie in power because their priorities are different. And because if the people under them knew their real priorities, they would rebel against those priorities. And so I think it's a good demonstration of people lie to further their own ends. Whether or not that's a good thing, it probably isn't, but that is a reason why people do what they do.
I was thinking about the definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again, thinking you'll get a different response, and how Kaladin waking up and doing the same thing, thinking he'll get a different response from the Bridgman is a good connection to Syl's questions of madness and lying, because it asks the question of is Kaladin mad in that moment? Is Kaladin lying to himself, thinking that this will change them? And it's changing them, right? The different events are changing them. So it's not quite insanity, but at the same time, is it madness to live literally your last moments because Kaladin could die on the next bridge run. Any of them could die on the next bridge run. They all know that. And so is it madness to try to change when you're in such an oppressive space? And narratively, we know that change does come. But I think realistically, when you're in that type of space where there is no exit, it is a form of madness to think you can change it. It is a form of lying to think you can change it, since it won't change unless there's big, giant systemic changes, which is what requires the end of the Bridgeman. It requires a systemic change of giving up a shard blade, right? It requires a larger change in what Kaladin is doing in this moment. So Kaladin's effort of trying to change the Bridgeman itself is an answer to madness and lying, because he is mad in that moment and he is lying, even though it is bringing about change, even though it is, I would argue, a better response to living in oppression, rather than just trying to live your last, few spears on going out whoring and then enjoying the drink afterward, right? Which is what most of the Bridgemen are doing, which is a fine way to respond to that form of enslavement and that form of oppression. But at the same time, it is a mad form to say, maybe I can change this for the little bit of time that I may be alive until the next bridge run, right?
Another part that comes after Syl asks why men lie is we have this conversation where Kaladin first starts his rant against the Light Eyes, right? That all Light Eyes lie, and that they're all bad, and that he blames Amaram for the way that he is now. But then Syl brings up she's heard about a time when there were no lies. Kaladin tells her, oh, those are the stories of the heraldic epics. They're not real. You'll always find people telling stories about supposedly better days. You watch, a man joins a new team of soldiers, and the first thing he'll do is talk about how wonderful his old team is. So it's interesting that he talks about someone who will artificially inflate how good the past was, but maybe Kaladin is also artificially inflating how bad the past is, because that's how he can cope with what happened to him eventually. Because we get flickers of throughout the books that never really get explained, of his old commanders who taught him things, and good times he had, and maybe this relationship with a girl that we never really hear about. And there were good things that happened to him in Amaram's army, and he has to paint it all as bad in order to be able to live with what happened, instead of saying, like he says at the end of this, most times are neither good nor bad, they just are.
I was going to say, doesn't that go back to the callousness of the previous chapter before that? He has developed calluses, and he's done that by saying all Light Eyes are bad. I can't trust any of them. Rather than, and so those calluses are around his medical response, but it's also around his human response to that very negative moment of someone in charge murdering all of his friends, right? Which is very traumatic and very, very big. That would change my entire view of Light Eyes. And so it's I don't think we can fault Kaladin, but we can recognize that there's a callousness around that, where he's done what Lyran had wanted him to do with the surgery. He did that for his relationship to the Light Eyes.
I think I'd even go so far as to say is he doesn't have calluses, he has blisters. You touch a blister and it really hurts. You touch a callus and it doesn't hurt. Calluses don't hurt. Once you have a callus, you have a callus. And I've played guitar before. I have had calluses before. They don't hurt once you have them. They're just tougher skin. But a blister hurts every time you touch it. And it feels like Kaladin has a blister about Light Eyes. A justified blister, but it is one that anytime Syl tries to do anything positive, she's well, Dalinar Kholin seems to never lie, and he's instantly no, all of these men are liars, and can't react to that, which is definitely a trauma response. This is a response to his trauma. He is clearly aware it's a response to his trauma, because he says, "Storm you, Amaram, you did this to me." He'd been burned too often to trust the flame. Kaladin does recognize that. But I think there is a difference between the blisters that Kaladin has, and he's trying to lie, I think, to himself to keep himself from poking at the blister.
I think there's one more thing here we could read as being in response to Syl's question of why men lie. And that's at the end when Kaladin is trying to get one more man to give up their food, right? And he's talking to Teft. And Teft is arguing that, why keep caring? And Kaladin says it's either that or give up and die. And Teft says, and what if death is better? And then Kaladin pokes at him and says, you know that that's not true. Like, you know, I can tell that, like, I found out that death isn't better than going through this. And I think you know that too. And you know that you're lying to yourself about this because you don't want to have to do anything about your situation. So that's really interesting to me, that, like, sometimes we lie to ourselves to avoid having to actually face what we can do, right? To say, well, there's nothing I can do, or life isn't worth living, so I'm not going to try, or like, I can't get better at this, so I give up. And those are things that we do, lies we do tell to ourselves. All right, and our final segment is the Wisdom of the Heralds, where we each talk about what we want to take back into our lives after having done this reading of the chapter.
So mine is very short term. I do, in fact, have a doctor's appointment coming up next week, which is why I'm thinking about this a lot. And I'm going to make an effort to go into it with a callus and not a blister. To say I'm open to hearing what possibilities they are, but I think also maybe being open about the fact that this has been hard for me and asking them to, I guess, approach this the way Hesina would, or our idealized perception of what would Hesina do, of saying, I need some community to help me through this. Will you be a doctor who can be this with me? So I am going to try again. It's not going to be fun, but I will try again.
I think for me, it's going to be thinking more about how to create calluses that aren't callous, or how to create like responses to events and developments of being a human that don't create a callousness in you, but instead form just growth as a human being, and instead form more positive reaction to that idea of callous growing.
And I think one area that I've been struggling to grow calluses in is grading. I struggle to give my students bad grades even when they deserve it because I don't want them to feel bad. But I think I need to recognize that getting feedback that's honest, even if it's hard, is a way that you grow. That's a way that you grow calluses, is by actually really confronting the situation. And so finding a way that is maybe Hesina-like in, like, I'm going to help you through this. You got a C on this paper, but like, let's look forward and see how we can together help you get to the next grade, but not being afraid to be like, this is the actual situation, and not lie about it. Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.